hunt for Russian meddlers is not abating. Leaked messages sent by a BBC correspondent suggest that the broadcaster's news team is in search of any leads connecting Moscow and the Yellow Vest movement in France. In one of her messages, the BBC correspondent said that her editors were, quote, out for blood.
Well, maybe some Russian business is capitalising greatly on the protests. Maybe the protesters are eating cutlets en masse. Maybe the far-right are ringleaders there. I'm looking for angles, yes. The editors demand some blood.
The leaked messages were published by Russia's RIA Novosti news agency. Last week, a number of media outlets alleged that Russian bots or automated accounts were fueling outrage over the protests, with 1,600 tweets sent daily. The French authorities have launched an investigation into this. RT's Peter Oliver hit the streets of Paris to ask people there if they thought the Russians were, or even are, somehow interfering.
Over the last 5 weeks, we've seen France engulfed by violence as people come out onto the streets to say they simply can't afford to live under French President Emmanuel Macron. Text messages between a BBC Russia journalist and another reporter apparently show who to point the finger of blame at. Not the French government, not French taxes, but the Kremlin.
Taxes?
People can't really manage to
pay everything.
Life is so expensive.
Must be the Russians behind it, right? We asked the BBC to respond to these potentially embarrassing revelations. This is what they have to say.
As the French Foreign Ministry had spoken publicly about media reports of a possible Russian influence in the protests, it was perfectly reasonable for our correspondent to raise the subject. However, in the end, her reports made no mention of a possible connection with Russia at all. We stand by our impartial, independent journalism.
I spoke to some people here on the streets of Paris and asked them if they saw the shadowy hand of the Kremlin behind these demonstrations.
Everything's possible nowadays.
You should ask Trump. No, I'm joking, it's a joke. You don't know.
No, of course they're not behind, no.
Come on, they say the Russians were behind the U.S. presidency as well, so, you know.
No, come on, no. Of course, no.
We're French. We're never happy about everything.
We asked BBC Russia if they are still looking for connections between Moscow and the French protests and whether the correspondent was under pressure to pursue that particular angle. Sadly, they declined to comment. In the meantime, the Russian Foreign Ministry has criticised the BBC, accusing it of acting in a cynical manner.
The cynicism of journalists is amazing. We're talking about a company that has propagated all its life an unbiased and independent approach and its professionalism as the epitome of the media world. I have a question for these very British regulators of the media space and the public. How do they evaluate this kind of compilation of facts that employees of their television and radio companies are doing?
Russia-based journalist Brian MacDonald told us he's not surprised by the BBC's take on the story.
It's quite clear here that, they've gone for a very, very tenuous link between entirely homegrown French protests, which have absolutely nothing to do with Russia, in a desperate attempt to find some Kremlin angle to kind of, fulfill the agenda that they feel they must do at the moment, which is to get as much money as they can, I suppose, for the idea of fighting some info war with Russia. I can just off the top of my head, I can mention things like, Montenegro's, NATO vote recently, where Russia was supposed to have interfered in that. Some idiots is the only word I can use in Britain are actually trying to say that Russia was responsible for Brexit. Now, come on. Brexit has been on the table. Well, Euroscepticism in England's been on the table in England particularly, for, 25 or 30 years. You've seen how, in America, they've tried to make it look like Russia was somehow responsible for electing Donald Trump. So this is just the latest in a litany of, reaching like this.